Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Priya Natarajan. I'm the current director of the Franke program in Science and the Humanities at Yale, our flagship interdisciplinary program. I am delighted to invite you all back to today's discussion session following a fantastic colloquium yesterday given by Professor Brian Cantwell Smith. The title of his colloquium was Inference in a Non-Conceptual World. And as part of the Nature of Inference series, it has been our practice to follow up the colloquium by a distinguished speaker with a discussion and with a conversant, a distinguished researcher who might have a slightly different perspective from the colloquium speaker the previous day. And it is my absolute honor today to invite Professor Joseph Rouse from Wesleyan University to be the conversant and lead discussant today. Professor Rouse's primary research interests are in the philosophy of science and the history of 20th century philosophy, interdisciplinary science studies, and the social theory of practices. Within these areas, his primary foci include the philosophy of scientific practice, naturalism and anti-naturalism in 20th century philosophy, the metaphysics of normativity, the connections between the analytic and continental philosophy, the relation of philosophy of science to philosophy of mind and language and to metaphysics, cultural studies of science, and feminist science studies. He has he's authored many books, and he has a current manuscript under review, Social Practices as Biological Niche Construction, and in which he shows how and why to integrate our biological conception of human beings as animals and our social, cultural, and psychological conceptions of human beings as persons and accultured agents. So it is a real, it's going to be a real treat today to witness this discussion, interaction, and conversation. And as per custom, I'd like to invite you all to post your questions in the Q&A feature of the webinar. And before I turn over the floor to Professor Rouse, I would just like to once again thank the support from Mr. and Mrs. Richard and Barbara Franke, as well as the Templeton Foundation that have made possible this Inference series. And I also want to remind you that we are recording this, and therefore all participants are required to mute their audio and videos. So welcome once again, everyone. And Professor Rouse, the floor is yours. Thank you so much to both of you, and Brian, for you to come back again to participate in this discussion.
Okay, well, let me begin by sharing my screen, and then by first thanking Ty Camp and Priya Natarajan for the invitation, the Franke Center for the sponsorship, and especially Brian Cantwell Smith for his very rich and provocative talk. Brian has taken on the fraught domain of the relation between thought or language and perception and action, and with it, the demarcation of conceptual content from whatever is non-conceptual. As he notes in the case of Evans and McDowell, disagreements in this domain often turn on differing intuitions about or conceptions of what is conceptual or non-conceptual, with proponents then talking through one another. And one constant difficulty is to secure non-question begging characterizations of what we're talking about. Brian and I also differ in some respects in the end about what is or is not conceptual, but I'm confident we can avoid such unproductive failures. So I'm going to quickly overview the themes of the talk. First, I'm going to talk about four central aspects of Brian's talk with which I'm largely in agreement. First, what he calls an ontological rather than an epistemic understanding of the conceptual and non-conceptual content distinction. Second, his emphasis on the fine-grained richness and continuity of the world within which conceptual understanding is situated and to which it is accountable. Third, we agree on many of the key features of conceptual understanding, and I'll talk more about that shortly. And finally, concerning the constitutive normativity of the conceptual domain, which he in the end understands in terms of the inseparability of matter and mattering. So I'm going to go through those four themes first, but then I'm going to raise four primary questions in response to Brian's talk. First, I want to pick up on the question of whether his initial characterization of a feature space is the right way to think about the phenomena he's talking about. Second, I'm going to ask a question about whether the world that we inhabit is in the end non-conceptual, given the pervasive involvement of conceptual practices, languages, imagery, equipment, music, and so forth in the world. Third, I'm going to look a little harder at Brian's conception of the conceptual and ask whether, instead of starting from the kinds of conceptual structures that, say, someone like Evans is talking about, whether we should start from conceptuality in the wild, much as Brian's work on computation suggests we start with computation in the wild. And finally, I want to ask a little bit about the place of other agents in the world we inhabit and their bearing on the framing and grounding of conceptual normativity. So, first theme, in Brian's ontological account of intentionality and contentfulness. Most accounts of this tend to be what he calls epistemic. That is, they begin with an account of what I would call empty content, how someone takes the world to be, and then only then ask whether and how that content is fulfilled. And that's why epistemic accounts target objects as instantiating properties and relations and grouped into settings, into sets accordingly. The ontological understanding of the conceptual that Brian is interested in starts with involvement in the world, and then asks how aspects of it are takings of something as something. And the difference is that the epistemic account presumes that the something is objects, and we take it as having properties and relations. And Brian's account is taking the world as articulated into property objects and properties, and hence, and in doing so, both objects and properties are in the second something on the far side of the as. And that's why Brian thinks that epistemic accounts are actually implicitly ontological. That is, committed to taking the world as already articulated into objects. And that's what he's, of course, putting into question. Okay. The second theme, which I'll be very brief about because is that Brian thinks that the concept that there's a kind of fine-grained richness to the world that we encounter, and that this is vindicated in multiple ways. First, by ordinary experience, whose content in colors, in the speed at which we drive around a corner, and various other phenomena have a kind of fine-grained richness that outruns our conceptualizations. He also thinks that's true of scientific understanding, from the physics of fields, which are not discretely bounded, to the practicalities of cartography, which have to give boundaries to islands, mountains, forests, coastlines, and so forth, where there's no exactly determinate boundary to that. But first and foremost, I think for Brian, this is vindicated by the history of the computational and cognitive sciences. First, by the failings of good old-fashioned artificial intelligence. Second, by the practical challenges of real-world computation, and especially now by the comparative success compared to GOFAI of machine learning and second-wave AI. I agree on all three of these scores, but I will say something more shortly about how we characterize it. The third theme, some of the aspects of conceptual understanding that figure in Brian's account. First, that conceptual understanding abstracts from the diverse actual or possible particular realizations of the same conceptual content. Second, that conceptual understanding allows the recombinability of its concepts in various predicative, disjunctive, or hypothetical judgments, and in alethic, deontic, and temporal modalities, and various other reformulations. A third point, which he said less about, that Brian emphasizes in a number of places, is what he would call the causal non-effectiveness of conceptual representation. That my representing something by itself is non-consequential, and that it is also, as such, indiscernible by others. As he puts it at one point, you can't build an app that will ping every time someone in the world thinks about me, right? It doesn't have that kind of detectability. Now, it's important to realize that this is one place where Brian's ontological conception really matters. Because if you take conceptualization to be about a non-conceptual world, then on an epistemic account, that's going to lead to a kind of global skepticism or a global disconnection, right? That, we would be misrepresenting the world. For Brian, that's not the case because we're already in touch with the world, and that to be genuinely intentional and conceptual, that conceptual understanding then has to be concretized back in action or application, what he calls filling in, such that the conceptual content that's abstracted from then has to be filled in a concrete case to which we apply what we do. And finally, the fourth sort of initial theme is the normativity of intentional directedness. This is something that's pretty widely familiar, and indeed is the source of familiar concern to naturalize intentionality or conceptual understanding by explaining how physical systems that instantiate the conceptual can be answerable to conceptual norms. Traditional approaches to this question start with what Brian calls statical norms, truth, reference, and the like, right? And as the target of either naturalization or, for those so inclined, as the target of non-natural determination by reason. And from that account of the statical norms, it then builds dynamical norms of appropriate uses and inferences. Brian's experiences in the trenches of computer science, cognitive science, and AI suggest that that strategy is broken back. The dynamical norms of practice and use govern the statical norms of truth and reference. And this, he points out, has a very major consequence. In that case, something else must determine the dynamical norms, something other than merely preserving the statical norms of truth and reference. Brian's much more extensive response to this in his papers than in the talk is important but unconventional in terms of the normativity of ontology. For Brian, the dual sense of matter and mattering, of material ontology and material arguments or material considerations is no coincidence, but is in fact integral to what it is to be material. He further specifies ontology as the locus of a kind of natural normativity. This is now quoting from the paper from which the talk is drawn. Which abstractions a creature makes, and thus what objects there are for that creature, arises out of the constitutively norm-governed life that that creature leads. Its objects themselves exist in worlds governed by significance, interpretation, and importance. This is, I think, a broadly biological conception of normativity, and it frames Brian's account of truth as what is at issue and at stake in conceptual activity. Conceptual judgments are true, and the inferences we make are good, if so taking them fulfills the normative concerns that governs a conceptual system's projects and practices. Now, Brian notes and then rejects the widespread appeal to evolutionary adaptation to provide the relevant dynamical norms. And he thinks that's the case because he thinks that doesn't provide sufficient normative articulation. We need not just norms for maintaining a way of life and in terms of evolutionary survival, but for sustaining a meaningful life, a morally significant life. And these more richly differentiated normative concerns govern not only ethics, politics, and aesthetics, but also ontology. How the world we inhabit and answer to ought to be conceptualized in living such lives. So those four themes, I think, are things that Brian and I largely agree about. They are also fairly unconventional, even provocative in the context of most thinking on these subjects. Even though both our views are grounded in, and on the one hand, in Brian's work on the cognitive and computational sciences, both of our work in interdisciplinary science studies, and my work in the philosophy of scientific practice, evolutionary biology, and social theory. Despite that agreement and placement on one edge of contemporary debates, I do have some questions that point to consequential differences in how we develop and justify these provocative theses. I will have to be brief. I've written about them elsewhere at some length in both published and forthcoming work. So the first question concerns his initial sort of speculative characterization of the non-conceptual world as a space of features. There's underlying this, there's a tension in Brian's project. That is trying to give a conceptual grasp of a non-conceptual world as non-conceptual. And elsewhere, he recognizes that, for example, in the artificial intelligence book, by giving a demonstrative indication of the world as that which is registered conceptually, but can only be explicated in further conceptual explications. I have a couple of worries, though, about the move to feature space. One is that many of the kinds of things Brian is suggesting might be features of a non-conceptual world are actually interactive aspects of our engagement with the world. I think of Kathleen Akins's classic paper on thermoreceptors as not getting the as an objective feature, but how temperature matters to us, or colors as neither objective features of the world nor subjective qualia. And perhaps above all, of Karen Barad's conception of objects as not intrinsic to the world, but rather as intra-active, and hence a causal conception of things. There's a deeper point as well, and that is that Brian distinguishes perceptual registration of a non-conceptual world conceptually, and then doing conceptual work, and then practically filling in this. Whereas I think that perception and action are always going on together. All perception involves practical activity. All action is also perceptually responsive. And our engagement with that and the world we are in is densely causally entangled. So that's going to be my first question, the relation between causal entanglement or features as a way of getting at the richness of the world that we agree on. Second, I want to ask a question whether the world that we inhabit actually is, in the end, non-conceptual. And that's because the fine-grained richness of the worlds we live in, that we both agree about, is also cross-cut with ostensions, words, images, functional spaces, equipment, and social roles. These elements have a kind of dual character, right? Or that is, they are also part of the richly entangled fabric of the world, and they are also conceptually articulative. I think we need things like Adam Lowe's paintings and machine learning algorithms to abstract from our pervasive concrete engagement with our conceptually articulative practices. Phonemic articulation actually exemplifies this duality, right? We know that the phonemes people utter are continuous and indistinguishable, and yet they also function discretely to mark out distinct phonemes. And so part of what I'm suggesting here is, along with Brian, that a conceptually articulated world is not found, but we nevertheless live in it as already made by our practices. The third issue concerns whether we should start instead with conceptuality in the wild, following on Ed Hutchins's navigation in the wild and Brian's talk about computation in the wild. And I note that despite prioritizing dynamical norms, Brian starts with a characterization of conceptuality as statical. We only get to inferences as connecting more or less determinate conceptual contents. I want to talk about conceptuality in the wild, that is, in our conceptual practices. And that starts with material inference as integral to conceptual contents. The content of a representation involves its appropriate inferential connections with others. Second, in that context, our actual conceptual engagement with the world definitely includes the conceptual role of things like indexicals, demonstratives, anaphora, and their iconic and expressive equivalents, including the ways we negotiate conceptual disagreements via ostension, indirect quotation, interpretation, and so forth, right? So I want to, in this respect, conceptual understanding is not under our control. The ways we articulate the world conceptually and assess its normative significance is continually negotiated with other agencies. Human, to be sure, but I would also argue non-human. And like McDowell actually, that's going back to the indexicals point. I share with McDowell this emphasis on indexicals as conceptual, but for very different reasons. Finally, then I would add that part of why I think GOFAI failed is not merely that it didn't get at the richness of the world, but it also abstracts from the richness and complexity of our conceptual life. And so the moral I would draw is that conceptuality has to start with the dynamics of use and not with the static structures of conceptual systems. My final question reconsiders normativity, evolution, and the social ecological world that we inhabit. I completely agree with Brian in invoking the normative complexity of human lives and hence the inadequacy of appeals simply to evolutionary adaptation. Now, he understandably doesn't say much about the normativity involved here in detail. He did more than enough for one talk. But I note that he does seem to want to begin with the ontology of our conceptual engagement with the world before situating it in a broader normative space. And I just think that in the end doesn't work. Evolutionary biology in its traditional focus on adaptation won't do. But evolutionary biology now gives us much richer resources for understanding dynamical norms in terms of organism-environment entanglement, ecological developmental biology, and niche construction, among others. And so looking to the end of Brian's talk, I think we need to ask how and why our practices engage the world at spatiotemporal modal distances, for which its conceptual abstraction from current situations is useful. I think both the need for long distance understanding and the possibility and normative authority of our conceptual practices emerged first through the evolution of a cooperatively interdependent way of life among early hominins. And that in turn enabled our current practice differentiated way of life. The practices we each take up here and now are closely interdependent with other practices and ways of life that nevertheless mostly take place at a distance. Our need to sustain that cooperative interdependence among diverse practices and practitioners is why conceptual capacities evolve and persist as long-haul trucks and highways for engaging with the world at a distance and more abstractly. That, however, has to be a story for another occasion.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe, for that fantastic and clearly laying out the points of agreement and the places where you have questions that were raised by Brian's talk yesterday. And so, Brian, now you have a few moments to engage with him before we have our questions readied up for both of you.
Okay, great. Well, listen, thank you, Joe. This is a fabulous, in fact, clearer, I think, especially up to the interlude, clearer articulation of what I wanted to say than I myself said it. I want to make a note, a kind of nod to John Hoagland, the late John Hoagland, the philosopher extraordinaire that Joe and I both knew. When Hoagland and I would talk late into the night often, we developed a habit of saying to each other, "That's what I was just about to think." And some of what you have done, Joe, here is, I think, you've earned this moniker, I think, of respect and agreement of, yes, that's what I was just about to think. So thank you for that and for that clear articulation. I want to say a couple of things. I'm not quite sure in what order, but maybe this. I think maybe one of the most important things going on in your response and my characterization is that I do lean a little bit towards Evan's conception of conceptuality. And my sense is you're of a McDowellian. And I actually am more of a McDowellian myself as well, in the sense that I kind of agree more deeply with McDowell. I think his taking on the issue of being engaged with the world cuts deep. So you, I think, this is fair to say, especially, for example, in your third point of dealing with conceptuality in the world, in the wild, of course, in the world too, but in the wild. I think the kind of conceptuality that you're getting at is what would be going on in the wild might include things that I wouldn't, in my talk at least, have called conceptual. Now,
that's absolutely right.
There is an issue as to how we should use this word, because one possible question I could have got yesterday, and I was wondering if I get it, and nobody actually asked it, is the following. Look, Brian, your sense of, remember I said yesterday that the conception of the ridge didn't turn the ridge into a sort of conceptual object. It was still the rich object that it was. Somebody might have asked me, look, is there any conceptual ontology, or is that just a sort of theoretical fantasy that people have used as a way of explaining actually the content of language and so on and so forth? And I actually think it's a mistake. There actually isn't any, that human intentionality never is fully conceptual in the sense, in Brian's sense of conceptuality. Certainly, I think, and I think this matters to the discussion, I do not think that all of our thought or all our use of language is in fact conceptual. Remember, I talked about the poets. I talked about that quote from Henry James and what it was that his words did to our understanding of afternoon tea. Now, in a way, if you went the McDowell route and your sort of conceptuality in the wild route, you might think that, look, that quote from James is an indication of how powerful conceptual articulation is, such that it's not anything like as restricted as Evan's conception. And I would probably answer, yes, isn't it amazing how powerful human understanding is? And I'm not sure I want to say that that's human conceptual understanding. So I think the first glass of whiskey we need to drink is on how, okay. You and I both agree that what conceptual means is not God-given in advance. It has to do with the practice we're engaged in, all this kind of stuff, and so on and so forth. We can recite the canon. What it would be most useful and most penetratingly insightful for us to do with this word conceptual and what it is that it should refer to, I think, is not yet known. At least, I mean, I think that would be a real issue of substantive. Well, it might look like a mere issue of semantical debate, as the word semantics is used in Barnes and Noble. I think that's a real issue, because where are the joints or boundaries and so on and so forth in our understandings? I said that we live in this middle region and move back and forth and stuff. And in my sense of what it is to pick up a cup, look, can you hand me that cup? And what happens? I mean, what's his name? Rick Grush is very good on this. I think how the forms of representation that actually guide your hand take over from anything that is conceptually available to you and actually guide your hand so that it can pick up that cup successfully. You know, how much of that you want to include in your sense of conceptuality and so on and so forth, hard to know. So we may differ a little bit on where we think it's useful to bring down the word conceptual. That's one thing. I do want to make a comment, though, on this applies to evolution and the richer suite of resources it provides us, but it's more easily explicable, I think, with respect to Karen Arad and her intracausal interactions and so on and so forth. There is a causalism that I think, you know, Karen is a social construction person. She's not a reductionist on any normal notion of reduction, except I think she has drunk the causalist Kool-Aid that underwrites naturalism, and she thinks you can actually give an account through causal interactions and actually get everything that way. And my sense is that what's happened to us intellectually in our evolution, if you like, is that forms of causal interaction and maybe evolutionary arguments and cooperation and so on and so forth were initially what led us to develop maybe language and so on and so forth, but that we've outstripped those resources. And my sense of wonder at that which is causally inaccessible, I mean, you know, the notion of the light cone, for example, and I can imagine things outside the light cone, even though no one I've ever interacted with has interacted with stuff outside the light cone and so on and so forth. I mean, just by definition, that's what a light cone is. But the nice thing about a light cone is not madness. It's actually very highly accepted. And I think the fact that we understand it and that we wonder at it, we wonder at the universe and so on and so forth. Well, the second whiskey is, even with its newfound resources, is modern evolutionary theory still, has it drunk the causalist Kool-Aid? Or do we actually need something more than that in order to be oriented towards, to have deference to, wonder about, and so on and so forth, that which is beyond any causal interaction? And I have a ton of respect for that which is not within our reach. I mean, was it Yeats? A man's reach should exceed his grasp, right? I apologize for the sexism, but the reach of our understanding outstrips our causal grasp, even no matter how social and historical and so on and so forth you take the social grasp and so on and so forth. So that's that causalism, the causal Kool-Aid that I think permeates what I think you're saying and how it differs from what I think. How much the causal Kool-Aid is in fact correlated with any of our other agreements or disagreements, that's a question I think that would take thought, but that would be That would be worth exploring. And then the thing about the features and the fact that I introduced this stuff, conceptually in a certain sense. I tell stories, right, about, look, isn't it like this when in fact you're paddling down the river and, whatever, and so on and so forth. Now you can say, look, that's a conceptual account because you've used words. That would be a conceptual account only if the use of words was intrinsically conceptual, which I think my aversion to poets and so on and so forth suggests that I don't think. So that potential critique, I think, hinges on the first thing I was saying about the use of the word conceptual and so on and so forth. But I also think that this phrase, that which I dip my paddle into, that which I drink down and say, this is a fabulous 24-year-old year smoky scotch or something. That which I drink isn't rendered conceptual by the fact that I have referred to it by these words, that which I drink, even if I and drink are formulated as words. Because I think and this was in a way my point about the reference of the reference of terms towards things that they conceptually structure. I don't think the reference of words is restricted to a conception of those, right? The actual reference, the reference in the world, not the meaning. I don't think that which I refer to is rendered conceptual in virtue of the fact that I have referred to it using even concepts, let alone words. And so that, I think, I feel as if there's a kind of profound deference to how, I'm almost tempted to run into what language might be, to language that people might think of as almost religious. Deference to that which transcends my understanding, I think, permeates what I'm trying to say. And I think it's important. I don't want to give that up lightly. I think there is humility and a deference and a recognition of that which is beyond, that which lies beyond, which people have struggled to give voice to in human history, in many traditions, mystical and not otherwise, and so on and so forth. And I don't think it's empty. I don't think the fact that it's being used words is empty. So that fundamental deference, the fundamental non-commitment to causalism, and that Kool-Aid, and maybe our difference in the use of the word conceptual, and God knows many other things. So, but thank you for your wonderful comments.
Yeah, a couple of things that I think are really interesting here, because the points on which you're calling attention to the differences, I think, are all interrelated. Okay, so we'll start with the causal point. I think that one of the things we've learned from thinking in the philosophy of science about causality is that the way you're talking about causality has the same problem that you think traditional way of talking about the world is. That is that causal entanglement is as rich and dense and we want to say multifactorial, but of course,
right,
it's prior to the distinction.
Right, the articulation of it, yeah.
Right. And that we variously model and abstract causes, discrete causes, and conceptualize them from that causal entanglement. So it's first of all emphasizing that we are that we are part of and entangled in that larger conceptual unity. The unity, not in the sense of non-heterogeneity. On the contrary, causal relations are enormously diverse, right? But we have to do work to abstract and structure them.
No,
But Joe,
no, just to quickly interrupt, I mean, aren't causal relations, for example, in physics, they're always mediated by what we call as laws, right? I mean, these relations are informed by conservation laws or what have you, right?
Well, I have a whole long account of how to think about laws and and modal invariance, which is absolutely crucial to scientific understanding, and its connection to the normativity of scientific practice. And so this is a long chapter of articulating the world. But it emphasizes that laws are ways of conceptualizing and projecting concepts in ways that are accountable to the practices and concerns of the discipline. So that would actually fit law-governed conceptualization into something like Brian's.
no, but look, this is an agreement I don't think I want to swallow. Because I think, first of all, I think with Priya, I mean, I think of, okay, so there's this notion of effectiveness in computer science, effective computation. And what that is something I'm actually writing about at the moment. And an effective property, maybe a causal property. I actually think the word effective in computer science is a better word than causal because there's so much complication with respect to causal. But to go to Priya, I mean, there is a kind of look, falls off as 1 over r squared, is local in time and space or something. There is something about the aboriginal notion of causation in physics and stuff that you can't actually, violate and do consequential work. It is absolutely fundamental. Computer science would actually be empty if that were not a restriction. And the question is, can you understand deference to that which is absent within an account which actually obeys, all the regularities of which, in fact, fall under the 1 over r squared, falling off as 1 over r squared kinds of constraints of effectiveness. And I think the answer is no. And the fact that the scientific revolution, can be characterized as, in fact, this fabulous hypothesis on, who knows, Descartes' part, if you like, Bacon and stuff, that in fact the world can be explained in virtue of its causal nature and its causal laws and stuff, has to have substance. If you generalize the notion of causation to be everything that scientists can actually come up with accounts of regularities and stuff, then causal doesn't mean anything anymore. Scientific revolution is not a particular insight. And the thing is, I think computer science shows us that it's an extremely important insight that is in fact differentiates what's computable and not. And if you generalize the notion of effectiveness, I can solve the halting problem for 25 cents or even a nickel. So I want to say that reference is not causal, but hanging on to a notion of causal such that reference isn't it is actually fundamental to doing justice to science. And so I think you generalize the notion of causation at the peril of understanding what science is and what constrains it.
Well, two things. The other point I was going to make is that, in fact, the kinds of notions of effectiveness and the limits of effectiveness that you're talking about are also very, very important from my view, as are the role of modal invariance in the sciences and the different kinds of modal invariance in different fields. The ways in which there are law-governed relations in the life sciences, for example, that hold even under counter-nomological hypotheses in terms of the laws, right? I mean, classic example that the Fisher explanation for sex ratios at birth would hold even if the physics of and chemistry affect sex determination were different. So we can handle that. I agree with you on the point about, let's say, understanding what's beyond the light cone, right? We are able to do that indeed, we're able to talk about and understand all sorts of things at distances and reserve that we have no direct causal contact with. Okay, I mean, there's no problem with that. The point I'm making is that you can only do that because you are already participating in a wide variety of causal practices that enable that account to have that conceptual content.
But Joe, I might agree with you, but only in the following sense. And this is something I said to Dan Dennett once.
Yeah.
Which is, look, you keep going back to biology and you keep going back to the evolutionary account of our emergence. And I said, yeah, that's the train we got here on. I am not arguing that that's the train we got here on, but I don't think the train of how we got here is an actual explanation of where we are. So the fact that that's how it emerged, which is, of course, the kind of explanation of something that someone who believed in causes would tend to think was explanatory because you're explaining something by its causal emergence.
Well, no, Brian, here's
only the train.
Here's the point.
But the trajectory matters, right? I mean, the trajectory matters of how you got here. Right?
It does indeed. And see, part of the point here is that I'm in agreement with you that there's more to the world we inhabit than we can articulate conceptually. Okay, but I'm thinking about that in a slightly different way than you are, because I do think that the ability to engage with, for example, the fine-grained richness of the world and the multiplicity of causal entanglement can be indicated conceptually. Now, here's the example that seems to me striking. It's the more, which we can also indicatively point towards, there's more to the world than we understand. More, right. More in the heavens than earth than you've dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio, right?
Yeah.
But that's not the fine-grained richness, which admittedly, we can't reproduce in words, and we don't want to try. Even the poets are not reproducing it or representing it in its detail, but evoking it. The contrast is to those aspects of the world that are utterly beyond our ken. And I think that's one of the things that the history of the sciences brings out for us. That is what it is to bring whole domains of the world that we can now talk about, engage with, in part, of course, by constructing experimental systems, enable us to get it to show up in particular ways that previously were completely ineffable, right? We talk about the growth of knowledge of the sciences, but actually what's been most striking is the growth of what we can talk about, what we can actually engage with and make sense of, bring into the conceptual domain. And there.
So I mean, it's sort of the confluence of ideas and instruments, not just ideas, because it's the instruments that enable new conversations about ideas and generate.
And the practices in which we employ those instruments and the situations in which we're in. I mean, here's a lovely recent example. Oh, the ways in which genetic sequencing has uncovered a massive proliferation of the microbial world that couldn't be, we had no clue this was there because we had no way to culture it, and which is the only way to get access to. But that's the more of the world, and and it's actually our conceptual capacities which enable us even to articulate that, right? So we're in agreement to a great deal, and my worry is that we actually need to recognize in scientific understanding the entanglement of the modal and the normative. That causality is not one kind of relation, but a rich panoply of entanglements, which we then model, articulate, and engage with, in part, of course, by instruments in creating phenomena in laboratory that bring things out, and also by building inferential relations, including the poetic inferential relations, which do an important sort of work. So you're worried that I'm making the poets too conceptual. I think Priya was initially worried that I'm making the scientific understanding too poetic.
Poetic, yes.
Right? And what I want to argue is that the making of it as poetic is actually the causal niche construction, reconstruction of the worlds we can encounter. And that involves not just new words, but new practices, new engagements. It depends on the stuff that we are.
Even new logics, if need
Oh, well, yeah, sure. No. And the final point, because you were raising as a worry, a possible worry about your talk. Someone might say, well, the kinds of abstract conceptual structures that, say, Evans is talking about don't really refer to anything. That's not my view. My view is that they have an important expressive role in enabling us to talk about the rich, entangled conceptual relations in the wild. But they are dependent, just as you are arguing that our ability to talk and conceptualize and represent at all depends on our involvement in the world, which we completely agree about, right? That I think that our ability to articulate these formal relations are expressions of and dependent upon the much richer set of material inferential relations, including the ways in which we differ about them. So you and I can talk about what is conceptual, even though we have different agreements about exactly what the conceptual is, because in the end, we're talking about many of the same practices, about scientific understanding, about causal relations. And the question is how to articulate that.
But I think I don't disagree with you about the vast, expansive role of imagination of, instruments and practices in science and so on and so forth, how it's opened up this, all this kind of stuff. I mean, the flourishing, the expansiveness, the richness, the entanglement, and so on and so forth, all of the things that you say, which I think Priya is nodding by, she's not the best poker player here.
Fortunately, we're not playing poker.
Yeah. And we are not playing poker, right?
That's good. I would have lost already. I agree with all of that. The question is that germane? Like how comprehensive is that? The realms that are being expanded by these discussions. This is where you're a Baradian, and I think I think this causal Kool-Aid goes deeper than this issue of conceptual and non-conceptual. I think you really drank this Kool-Aid. You have a sense that you can sort of get it.
Before I met Karen.
We are going to have to invite Professor Barad to comment here.
Yes, she's
here.
here.
As soon as you finish, yeah.
I've wanted to. I actually have notes on a because her title, Meeting the Universe Halfway, is such a great title. But causal interactionism, I think, just screams at me with the limits of what it is that her metaphysical conception, right? And I want to say, look, you want to not be a reductionist, and you've successfully achieved not exemplifying so many of the properties of reductionism, except the fundamental one, which is to actually think that you can explain things in terms of causal practices and causal regularities and all of this kind of stuff. And I don't think that what Yeats was talking about, or, it's funny you say that, we understand that there's more that, there's more to the world than is dreamt of in your philosophy or something. I think we agree with that. I actually had a quote in my book about there's less in the world than is dreamt of in your philosophy, which I stole from, what's his name? The guy who wrote Ways of World Making. Anyway, my dad was an Islamicist, if I can bring up a different topic, and he actually felt that the right way to understand the Muezzin's call on Friday night was, I know that there's more to Allah. It may be Allah. to Allah than I know there to be, or something. And the Allah stuff doesn't really matter, I think, in these foundations of religious practice. It's like, I know that there is more than I know that there is, kind of. And the contradictory nature of that, I think, is sort of crucial. And I guess I feel like,
why do you say that it's contradictory? I mean, it's just having awareness of the limits of knowledge, right? I mean,
well,
limits of your conceptual knowledge or your ability.
Well, no, it's tricky, because if you said there's more than the world than I understand, that would be easy. To say that there's more than I know that there's more than I know there to be is, that's kind of, I mean, it's a challenge, right?
There's another layer wrapped up there.
Another layer there. I guess my sense of what has mattered to me about people I've known, just to be very personal about this, is actually a shared deference to that which is beyond rich patterns of causal interaction and engagement and so on and so forth. I find the restriction to I mean, you're absolutely right, extremely rich and extremely being better understood all the time and so on and so forth. Patterns of causal interaction, I think, and causal engagement and all of this kind of stuff. I mean, the stuff that the scientific revolution actually opened our eyes to, I think it just feels to me like a projection onto the wall of the cave, and that no matter how rich the shadows are, that there was something to the scientific revolution's claim that we can explain the universe in these terms, even if Descartes had no idea about the resources of evolutionary biology now and so on and so forth, the niche construction and God knows what. I think it's still a shadow of that to which we defer.
Right.
As I think it is part of what that to which we refer.
Well, of course, I agree with that.
And it only gets its sense as an ongoing and open-ended articulation of that, right? Because, I mean, the two things...
Right, no, we would agree with that, but the question is that open-ended exploration open to any understanding we get of it, or is it closed methodologically because of a commitment to causal explanation? And I think if it's the former, then there's nothing to science.
I wouldn't say it's closed, but it's restricted, right? If you have a commitment to causal.
Well, if you have it restricted to causal, then I think you're not going to explain things that, in fact, the fundamental constituent regularities of which are not causal. And I think reference is one thing, the fundamental regularities of which are not causal. That's, I think, the importance of that impossible iPhone.
And see, I think this is where there's actually more agreement than you think, because reference in the sense in which you mean it, okay? So the way in which you can utter sentences that refer to things that we are causally disconnected with, I have no problem with, okay? We do that. That's one of the next question. How do we do that, right? And, this is where I think the dynamical norms of conceptual articulation and the ways in which the concepts themselves get their content from how we engage with the world, how we engage with one another. But the concepts relate to one another inferentially, which allows you to express new things. Maybe you have to write a novel in order to develop the concepts to point to, often what novelists are doing, right? But they're thereby allowing us to refer to things that we previously couldn't refer to.
Well, I think there's truth to that, but the problem is to argue that they do that in virtue of rich causal engagements and stuff is circular, because in fact, if the reference of the novel is something that rich patterns of causal engagement can't explain, then in fact what it is that they're referring to can't be explained that way. The thing is, my sense, I mean, this is the McDowell part of you, I think, that I think is actually a little bit incompatible with the Barad part of you. One of the senses I have of McDowell is that part of what it is to be conceptual for him is that it is in fact part of a conception of the world, right? And McDowell is not anyone who's lost any sleep over not being compatible with any scientific results. That's one of the virtues of being in Pittsburgh philosophy department. But the thing is, the conception of the world, holding things accountable to being part of the world, right, which is something McDowell feels, I think, and something Hoagland actually believed in deeply. I think that conception of there being a whole world, that which is one, that beyond which there isn't anything, and so on and so forth, I don't think that can be explained in terms of rich patterns of causal.
Okay, so I think at this point, we should probably invite, if Professor Barad is interested in commenting.
Absolutely. And also, next year, you have to invite us all to bring the novels we're going to write.
Well, not me.
Sorry, Priya, I didn't mean to interrupt that.
No, not at all. I have invited Professor Barad to...
Yeah, hi. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, hi,
Thank
Karen.
you both for this amazing exchange. I'm just going to be super brief by saying that I don't know how much Joe is a Baradian, but I'm certainly a Rouseyan, and I think that I think that Joe has done a marvelous job addressing Brian's objections about this, and so I'm just going to leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Karen. It was
Thank you, Karen. I had no idea you were here. So
otherwise, we wouldn't have talked about me drinking Kool-Aid, I bet.
I would not have.
No, yeah, we'll bring you in on the whiskey. That will be much more fun.
I look forward to that. Yeah,
that'll be great. The first round's on me.
Correct. Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I guess I have one quick question, but I think I'll wait and I'll turn it over to people in the audience today. And I think Jun Lau has a question. It seems that under Brian's conception of both conceptual and non-conceptual forms of normativity, there is no reduction to causation, evolution, or practice. Thus, the debate here may not be about conceptual versus non-conceptual per se, but about the constitution of normativity. By Brian's conception, the non-conceptual world plays an irreducible role in the constitution of normativity, conceptual or non-conceptual, and that aspect is not captured by causal, evolutionary, and practical accounts. Is that correct? Yeah, I think this is my understanding too, but I could have missed something.
But I think Jun's comment is actually interesting. The last sentence, I think, it's too easy to answer it in the way in which it's framed. So I want to sort of raise the ante and then also agree with the raised ante version. Is it captured by causal, evolutionary, and practical accounts? I think that's correct. It is not. But I would say something stronger, which is that the constitution of normativity in the human case, and I don't know about other biological animals, I think this might be a place we actually have sort of transcended our biological heritage. The constitution of normativity, conceptuality, and non-conceptuality in the human case is not captured by causal, evolutionary, or practical phenomena. So in other words, it's not just the accounts, it's what those accounts are accounts of, I think, that is not enough. So yes, I agree with you and raise you one.
Great. Thank you so much, Jun, for that great question. So as we wait for more people to chime in with their questions, so I wanted a clarification, right? So, and the clarification is about the negotiation of conceptual disagreements, right?
Yeah.
So, so is it that the arbitration or negotiation between different conceptual accounts of reality is not actually challenging per se at the end of the day because you share a lexicon and a language? Or are there incommensurable, not that I want to sort of evoke Kuhn here, but
Neither one. And I think this is an important question, I think, because what I tend to do, I think, would tend to do with the conceptual disagreement is I would say, look, come over for dinner. let's just sit down, and maybe we're going to go walk around the field, and now why? Because having dinner and walking around the field and having libations in common and so on and so forth is a form of engagement that is not entirely within the conceptual realm. And I don't think that sharing a vocabulary, I mean, we do share vocabulary in some sense, right? I know this word, conceptual, for example, and it's different across the languages. I mean, it's interesting that in French, I believe conscience is the French translation of two words in English, conscience and consciousness. And I have asked people who are native French speakers whether they actually have, French makes only one notion such that we English have pulled it apart, or what's going on and so on and so forth. And I've had different answers. Some French people who are trained in analytic philosophy and stuff think, look, it's just a word that's used for both things and no French person is confused. And I've had other French people say, no, that's absolutely right. And it's interesting and it matters to French society and so on and so forth. So the point is, sharing words is tricky, but I don't even think if Joe and I, who are pretty damn close in this pantheon, if we use a word, we may use the same word, but that doesn't mean we mean the same thing or are getting at the same thing. And I remember saying this to John Barwise and John Perry once, and I said, look, I don't think that when, we use, that words mean different things in different contexts of use and stuff. And they said, yeah, no, we agree with that. But by and large, within a sort of American society in the late 20th century, whatever, they mean the same thing. And I said, no, that's not right at all. I think, in fact, even when I use a word, I'm not sure it means the same thing at the beginning of a sentence and at the end of a sentence. And they said, yeah, we know. So I think it's not an absolute disagreement. It's not that if we use the same word, that therefore we mean the same thing. I don't think it means it's incommensurable. I don't think it means we can't learn from other people. When I said to John Hoagland, look, that's what I was just about to think. My mind can be stretched, and it's stretched by Joe. And he's adjusting, it's like bending a note on a guitar or something. It can bend what the word means for me and so on and so forth. I think that the nature of our concepts is much more plastic and fluid and contextual and all of this kind of stuff than, with all respect, the questioner at least connotes with that question.
And I would want to add there that process of ongoing negotiation of our concepts and words with one another and with what we're talking about, and the sense that this is accountable to the world is right. Really, really crucial to all of this. So when you talk about, what our words mean and what we're talking about, right? What I want to draw a slight differentiation there, right? Because I come into our conversation with, let's say, a word like conceptual or a word like causal, with a richly entangled set of inferential relations which differ from yours. Okay, there's some overlap, but there's a lot of differentiation. And, but of course, we're committed to the idea that, as I think characteristic of what it is to be conceptual, that these can be adjudicated and worked out. Not that we will, but that they can. Mm-hmm. And this involves reworking and engaging the,
Yeah.
But where
and something like the very point you're making, that objects and properties are on the far side of the something as something, right? That we're having to renegotiate what we think, objects become the point of contact and ostensive pointing out. I'm talking about that. And
right.
you
but I mean, in
characterize
all
that differently than I do.
Right.
That provides a point, which is then, exactly what we mean, i.e. what we should mean, lies ahead of us. So that, in that sense, on my account, normativity and temporality are normativity and conceptuality are temporal phenomena.
Nice. No, but in all of
Out
this,
of
then
past
what is
practice and looking
stability?
ahead. Yeah,
So
Priya.
is stability of meaning a casualty then? I mean, is there stability of meaning or?
I think about being in the North Atlantic in a small boat. If you're standing in a small boat in a North Atlantic storm, stability doesn't come from being rigid. If you stand rigidly, you're going to be tossed into the drink. Stability arises from being extremely capable of dancing. And so I think there are stabilities that require exquisitely fine orchestrated movements and so on.
Yeah.
But the thing I want to say to Joe here is think about axiomatizations of arithmetic and stuff. How do you negotiate different logical systems and so on and so forth, right? And figure out whether, in fact, piano arithmetic is consistent, or whether, in fact, getting rid of, what's his name, Peter Axel, who has this axiom that, in fact, allows self-membership in sets, but the whole thing's consistent and so on. There are norms on axiomatizations of arithmetic. Now, all the axiomatizations are going to be effective, right? Because, in fact, if you don't require syntactic axiomatization to be effective, the whole thing drops into vacuity.
Yeah.
So they're negotiated. And then there are theorems about these things. But they're meant to be axiomatizations of arithmetic and of mathematics and stuff. And those things are not themselves effective subject matter. And I don't think the development of axiomatizations of mathematics, of course, it has an effective causal history. It has to, because, in fact, we're all physicalists. But the fact that it has an effective causal history doesn't mean that it's explained by the syntactic manipulations, right? I mean, that's one thing Barwise said that was the fundamental result of 20th century logic, was that you couldn't reduce semantics to syntax.
And we're in agreement here.
Well, but then the question is, can semantics be given an account in a... Boy, Karen, I have such respect for you that now that you're in the audience, I'm very reluctant to speak. Can you give an account that explains the wrestlings in the foundations of mathematics with axiomatizations of arithmetic in the terms of these complex patterns of entanglement and so on and so forth? And my intuition is ultimately no. You've got to actually refer to the mathematical entities that people are trying to give, explain, through a glass darkly. I don't denote that. But through a glass darkly.
But Brian, was Karen going to come in on this, or was that you, Priya?
No, it was just me. I was going to say that we have a couple of questions as well that are
okay.
So there's one that Ty has. Ty, did you want to go ahead first?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for this exchange. In the article, Brian, that you submitted for your talk page, the third day, so you write about the registration effect of Lowe's painting, right, versus the abstractness, the abstraction of presentation of Magritte in The Treachery of Images, otherwise known as Ceci n'est pas une pipe. So from my limited understanding, from what I gleaned from the article, our civilization was not until fairly recently, it seems, producing paintings like Lowe's. Is that because we had not yet evolved enough to extend what you call that middle distance? And if so, what kind of painting might we evolve into the more we learn to extend said middle distance?
Well,
you have a historian of art and historian of modern contemporary art here. So
yeah, no, I know. So now I'm heading.
Where do we go after data? In other words.
A mad dog or an Englishman, right? I'm gonna tread where only fools would go.
Go ahead.
Think about My Name is Red. Orhan Pamuk's book about Islamic miniatures and so on and so forth, right? And the paintings talk in that. And there's a painting that says, look, in the sort of conversion to modernism and stuff, I wasn't meant to represent what a tree looks like. I was meant to represent the soul of a tree or something like that. And I'm not sure. I mean, think about prehistoric, images of pregnancy goddesses and so on and so forth. I'm not sure that they were not synapsm type representations. So I don't know if it's true that it's only recently that we have paintings like Adam's painting of that door. I would defer, but we've got to invite Adam. I'm not sure. I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, I'm also going to step into where I shouldn't be treading. But I mean, Adam's paintings do have a history. Think back to Impressionism and the effort to capture the look of things, right? And part of my point is that the ways in which we depict things and how we understand depiction and articulation in painting is also conceptual. I have no idea whether Gary Tomlinson is here in the audience at Yale, but Gary's work on music and its relation to language is also, I think, a really lovely example here to actually see the kinds of expressive capacities of music and how it articulates aspects of the world. I'm not attributing this to Gary, by the way, but that comes together with the kinds of practices that allow us to take things as being about something else, right? That was the dramatic innovation of practices which are in which we are dependent upon one another in ways that allow us to take what one another is doing as not,
so
clue as to what to do now, but as about something else. And that.
So Joe, do you think everything
constructions?
Do you think everything?
What is Adam's painting about and of? What is now? Of course, the other forms of pictorial articulation and depiction are working in different ways, and you have to actually get into how they're working and what they're doing and how they're seeing things as, and that is both the things and the as, right?
But do you think? I mean, I guess I want to say is. I mean, I think there are 2 points of disagreement here, which are conspiring together, and that's kind of tricky.
More than 2, I think, actually.
Okay. Yeah, maybe 9 of them are rolled up.
But they're all connected together. It's one agreement that has multiple elements.
But I guess what I want to ask is, look, Yeats and Henry James and the Bhagavad Gita and stuff, they all use words.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that they're all conceptual for you?
Well, it's not that they are words that makes them conceptual. It's in part they're belonging to conceptual and discursive practices that makes them words, right? And that we speak a language, and that gives us extraordinary expressive resources. New ways of combining them and speaking those words and engaging them in various settings that, of course, go way beyond. They are recombinable in rich ways that are not simply mathematically functional, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was trying to talk about yesterday with Nunberg's characterization of the rise of information. That yes, languages. Yeah,
and I agree with you on that. I mean, this is not concatenations of information.
Right, it's not good.
But I think the whole of conceptual life cannot be adequately treated that way.
Well, okay, so suppose we agree on that. Then if I ask you what you think about this McDowell debate, McDowell-Evans debate about can there be conceptual, non-conceptual content, is it unfair to say the following? No, somebody asked me, does Joe Rouse believe there can be non-conceptual content? And I say to him, this person, or whatever, no, Joe does not think there can be non-conceptual content because the very idea of conceptual content is for him sufficiently comprehensive with respect to our discursive practices that anything we say is going to be located in this historical and grounded and contextualized practice, such that and conceptual content for Joe is to be something meaningfully conveyed in that practice. And so therefore it's by definition, there can be no non-conceptual content. How much injustice does that do to you?
Well, I have problems with all of that.
Okay, good.
Conceptual and the non-conceptual with the notion of content, right? That is that I think that we can only do anything conceptual as part of a life engaged in the world interactively in an ongoing way. And that having these practices, which are on the one hand, very, very closely interconnected. So when we think about painting practices and the ways in which they comment on previous painting practices, but also are accountable to these larger, more long distance engagements, right? I mean, Impressionism arises in the 19th century for a reason to do with the insufficiency, the perceived insufficiency of a mechanistic causal in the narrow traditional sense.
Traditional sense, yeah.
And so, but they make sense in response to that. And so what I want to see us talking about is the way in which to push your point against the epistemic accounts of the conceptual further. I think you're conceding to epistemic conceptions of the accounts of conceptual contentfulness, that we have to think about concept use as practices, and referring is something people do, and they do it by participating in practices which enable us to then make sense of and understand things like referring beyond the light cone or pointing to those aspects of the world that we don't even have access to.
Right.
Didn't have access to the microbial
I agree with you
before that.
I agree with you about participating in these practices. I guess a lot of people that I interact with have an automatic causalist account of practice. That practices are things that involve bumping and shoving. That are subject to one of our R-squared laws, whatever, that preserve energy. I mean, all of these kinds of things. And I think, so I remember asking, did I mention this? Did I mention this question to Alonzo Church in the talk yesterday? Somebody.
I don't think you did.
I don't think you did. Yeah, I don't.
Anyway, okay. So Alonzo Church, when he was still alive, of course, was giving this talk at Stanford, and I was nervous and sat on my hands and didn't think I was going to say anything, but my imagination often unseats my politesse. And I asked him after the talk, if I refer to the sun, does it take 8 minutes for the sun to get referred to?
No.
No,
I know, but I just want to tell you what.
Yeah.
Church,
very knee-jerk goes there from both.
You don't have to be Alonzo Church to answer that.
Yes.
But two things. First of all, Alonzo Church said, reference travels at the speed of logic, which I think was a brilliant.
Oh, brilliant.
Even though I have no idea what the hell it means, but but the thing is, what matters to me is that there is a property of the sun that it was referred to. It's not just a property of us that we referred to it. It's actually a property of the sun such that it was referred to. And that property obtains of the sun. And now the relativity gets tricky. Does it obtain of the sun right now? I mean, is that even a coherent? I have to defer to Priya here.
Well, I don't know. I think we could get into a big controversy now. I think I will skirt and avoid this about whether it's really a property of the sun. I mean, I think the 8 minutes is not a property of the sun.
Well, no, but it's got to be a property of the sun in the sense that if I think a thought about you, that's about you. That's got to be a property of you, that you were thought about. I think if you lose that, you lose, we're in the Trump right-wing vortex.
I don't quite think so. But I think Peter Morgan has been very patiently waiting with his question. And well, he has a couple of questions. So he quotes, said by Professor Rouse in paraphrase, "There is more in the world than we can conceptualize. There is that in the world that we have so far conceptualized. How do we fit or place what we discover and conceptualize tomorrow into what we have so far conceptualized? Are there ideas of distance and betweenness as systematic indications of how surprised we are by new discoveries and conceptualizations?" And this also plays to what Professor Rouse just said. An ongoing discussion places new utterances relative to previous utterances, which then can be adjudicated and worked out systematically. We have to allow a story to continue, right? I mean, that's his sort of question.
And of course, the notion of distance here is not spatial distance, right? I mean, microbes that were inconceivable to us, except, in the sense of, well, there might be such things that we can't,
an abstract way, right?
Yeah, that's right, in an abstract and empty way. But that notion becomes concrete and rich once you are able to engage with that. And of course, you can only do that by drawing on and extending the resources, including the material practices that you already have. I mean, this is one of the key features that now thinking about philosophy of scientific practice that is, that the sciences exemplify, taking what the relationships they uncover and now turning those into resources for bringing out other things. That's part of how the sciences expand the realm of the conceptual, and also, of course, close off aspects, things that it once seemed to make sense to talk about, and now only makes sense to talk about in quotation marks, right?
Right. I mean, and I think
talking about when they referred to phlogiston.
Yeah.
They
Right.
no longer allow that.
This gets at the heart of the fact that scientific discovery, as we refer to it, is inherently provisional. I mean, that science itself is really, our conceptual understanding at any given time is deeply provisional. And
it's also temporally extended in directions. It's drawing on a history that gives us open-ended resources and allows it to point beyond itself.
Yeah.
And in ways that, and you talked earlier about not being able to define concepts. That's because the concepts always involve more than we're able to articulate now in detail, right? Typically, we have an opening of a space of exploration, and the words we use. I mean, think of the history of the word gene.
Oh, yeah.
And the way it went from a merely hypothetical entity to physical, to chemical, to structural, to information theoretic in quotes, to then being these complicated regulatory networks that turn out to be also epigenetically.
Yeah, it's become an amalgam of everything that it meant, right? So sort of. So
and you have to think about it, and of course, how the use of that word is going to get tied into practices and what follows from it, including, of course, all the other non-scientific resonances, the way in which its history was connected to notion, and especially the information notion of, notions of an immaterial soul that is at the heart of the body. That inferential connection was so crucial to the history of 20th century biology.
There was a great thing that John Hoagland and I used to say, that of course there have always been electrons, but there have only always been electrons since Rutherford.
Right. Also, let's not, much as I am fascinated by Bruno Latour, let's not go down the Latourian tunnel here with whether Pasteur, whether.
All right.
Right.
Bruno tried to get at some of that in one way, but that's not quite what Brian was saying.
Right. No. Yeah. But I think
and it is closely connected to this temporal externalism that I'm emphasizing as well. I mean,
right.
You and John and I actually have a lot in common on that.
Right, we do. That's why these disagreements are so unnerving.
Well, this was a lovely point that Ian Hacking once made. If two people disagree point by point on a half a dozen issues that they also take to be really centrally important, it means they agree on almost everything else.
Right.
That very nicely characterizes you and me.
So I think before we close, there's a request from one of our guests, Stephen, who came up. Would Professor Rouse be willing to share his slides?
Yes,
willing to share
happy to.
Yeah, and we can then add that on to our video.
Yes. Should I send that to Ty, or do you?
Yeah. Could you please go ahead to send it to Ty in a?
Well, I will do that.
Thank you. I'd like those two.
Yeah. So I think let me see if there is a quick question so that I think okay. There's a question. It's not going to be quick, but we'll try to wrap it up soon. So listening to this wonderful conversation, it's Jun Lau again. One wonders whether Brian and Joe understand subjectivity, scientific practices, human language, etc., differently. It seems that for Brian, subjectivity in any sort of human doings is as non-conceptual as the world is non-conceptual. Similar to a digital circuit, even with all the correct arrangement, it still needs to be taken to be digital for it to be digital. But for Joe, this does not seem necessary. Is this a fair understanding?
I agree with Jun, so it's up to Joe.
Well, subjectivity is typically not one of my words, right? I think it has too many problematic connotations which don't belong together. Many of the things that people talk about in those terms are really important, okay? And, the kinds of discovery of subjectivity, whether it's in things like impressionism in painting or in, the interior monologues of Joyce and so forth, right, is itself a reconception, in this sense, we now want to say that before Joyce, there were interior monologues, right? You didn't have the same conception of interiority, right? For it to show up that way. So the kinds of things people want to talk about in that way are important, but we needed a better vocabulary and a better set of practices for engaging with it, many of which have this kind of character of subjectivity as a kind of self-enclosure, right? Which I think, the subjective inner and the causal interactive outer. And that just seems to me really distorting of both.
Right.
So that would be my answer.
Okay. Great. Although we could keep going, I think in the interest of our audience's stamina, we should probably bring this to a close. And I just wanted to say thank you very much to Brian and Joe for this wonderful exchange and for clarifying a lot of things for us about the commonalities and the differences in your conceptual understanding. of the world. I'm going to just like enlarge it to
Thank
the
you
world.
all. This has been a delight.
Yeah, it's been a delight. Thank you, especially Priya, but also Guy and Ty and
Yes.
Karen and Joe and everybody.
Yeah, and I want to thank the audience for being here and participating and engaging with us. So with this, we bring the Inference, Understanding the Nature of Inference colloquium series to a close. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely evening. Bye.